There's a specific list of habits that almost every empath carries into their 50s, 60s, and beyond. Not because these habits were ever wrong exactly, but because they were built for a different chapter of life, one with more time, more physical reserve, and more reason to believe the cost of certain patterns would eventually balance out. Today we're covering 9 specific things worth stopping right now at this stage of life, not out of self-criticism, but because continuing them any longer costs more than most people over 50 actually realize until the damage has already compounded. Let's set up something important before we go through the list. None of these 9 things were ever character flaws. They were survival strategies, developed early, often for good reasons, that made sense at the time they were built. What's changed isn't the empath's character. It's the math. The amount of time and energy available to keep affording these patterns has genuinely shrunk, while the patterns themselves have often stayed exactly the same since they were first established, decades ago, under very different circumstances. The first thing to stop: apologizing for needing rest. This habit usually formed decades ago, when needing rest felt like an inconvenience to whoever depended on you: young children, demanding jobs, a household that required constant management. The apology became reflexive, attached to any moment of stepping back, regardless of how legitimate the need actually was. At this stage of life, continuing to apologize for rest does something specific and costly. It keeps you negotiating for something that should require no negotiation at all, spending energy justifying a need instead of simply meeting it, at exactly the point in life when that energy has become considerably more limited than it once was. The second thing to stop: taking on other people's emotional crises as though they were medical emergencies requiring your immediate, total attention. This pattern likely formed from decades of being the one who handles things, the one who stays calm while everyone else falls apart, the one whose presence during a crisis became so reliable that it eventually became expected, then assumed, then simply taken for granted. Continuing this pattern past 50 means continuing to treat every family member's, every friend's, every acquaintance's emotional turbulence as an emergency requiring your full deployment, when in reality, most of these situations were never actually emergencies at all. They were simply situations other people had learned you'd handle, if given the chance. The third thing to stop: staying in conversations, gatherings, or relationships past the point your body has already signaled it's had enough. This is different from the broader question of which relationships to maintain. This is about the specific moment-to-moment habit of ignoring your own body's signals in real time, pushing through fatigue, discomfort, or overstimulation because leaving early or saying something's enough has always felt ruder than simply enduring it. At this stage of life, the recovery cost of ignoring these signals compounds much faster than it used to, meaning a single evening of pushing through discomfort can now cost several days of recovery that it might not have required decades earlier. The fourth thing to stop: assuming other people's negative moods are automatically your responsibility to manage or fix. This habit tends to be one of the deepest and hardest to unlearn, because it's been reinforced for so long that it no longer feels like a choice. Someone else's bad mood simply, automatically, becomes a problem to be solved, a tension to be smoothed, an atmosphere to be managed back into comfort. Continuing this pattern past 50 means continuing to spend enormous amounts of energy on emotional labor that was never actually yours to perform, often for people who never explicitly asked for it and may not even want it, simply because the reflex to manage other people's internal weather has never been examined closely enough to be questioned. The fifth thing to stop: minimizing your own accomplishments or needs in conversation, out of an old habit of not wanting to seem like you're taking up too much space. This pattern usually developed early, often in family or professional environments where an empath's natural attentiveness to others got rewarded, while any assertion of their own needs or achievements got subtly discouraged. Continuing this well into your 50s and beyond means continuing to shrink yourself in ways that no longer serve any protective function they might once have had, simply because the habit itself has run for so long it now feels indistinguishable from simple humility, rather than what it actually is: decades of learned self-erasure. The sixth thing to stop: maintaining relationships primarily out of history or obligation, rather than actual current mutual benefit. This is one of the harder items on this list to actually act on, because decades of shared history genuinely do carry weight, and it's reasonable to value long relationships for what they represent. But continuing to invest heavily in relationships that have, for years, provided far less than they take, simply because we've known each other so long, means spending increasingly limited time and energy on connections that have already demonstrated, repeatedly, that they aren't actually reciprocal, rather than redirecting that same energy toward relationships that might still, at this stage, become genuinely mutual. The seventh thing to stop: waiting for permission from anyone to make decisions about your own time, your own space, or your own life. This habit often formed during decades of genuinely needing to coordinate around other people's schedules and needs, young children, demanding careers, family obligations that required real, practical consideration of other people's constraints. At this stage of life, continuing to seek permission or approval for decisions that are entirely your own to make means continuing to operate as though those earlier constraints still fully apply, when in many cases, the actual practical need for that level of coordination has genuinely diminished, even if the habit of seeking approval never got updated to reflect it. The eighth thing to stop: treating every request for help from someone else as an obligation you're required to fulfill, regardless of your own current capacity. This pattern tends to be one of the most deeply ingrained on this entire list because it often connects directly to identity, being the reliable one, the capable one, the person others can always count on. Continuing this pattern past 50 means continuing to say yes automatically before actually consulting your own current energy, health, or genuine willingness, simply because the reflex to be endlessly available has never been questioned closely enough to recognize that it's optional, not mandatory. The ninth thing to stop, and the one that ties everything else together: deferring your own genuine desires, the things you'd actually like to do, see, create, or experience, in favor of some vague future point when there will supposedly be more time. This deferral made a certain kind of sense decades earlier, when there genuinely seemed to be an abundance of time ahead to eventually get around to it. At this stage of life, continuing this deferral means continuing to treat your own genuine desires as permanently postponable, when the actual math of remaining time has shifted enough that eventually is no longer a safe or accurate assumption to keep operating under. I want to say something important about why these 9 habits specifically deserve attention now rather than being treated as generic, ongoing self-improvement work with no particular urgency attached. Each of these patterns individually might seem manageable to continue indefinitely, but taken together, they represent a comprehensive system for deferring your own life in favor of everyone else's, and that system, sustained across decades, becomes exponentially harder to interrupt the longer it continues, while the actual time remaining to benefit from interrupting it grows correspondingly shorter. I want to be clear about something before we move into the second half of this conversation. Stopping these 9 things doesn't mean becoming a different person, doesn't mean abandoning the genuine care and attentiveness that has always characterized who you are, and doesn't require any dramatic, sudden transformation. It simply means recognizing that these particular habits were built for circumstances that, in many cases, no longer apply, and that continuing them now carries a cost that decades earlier they didn't yet carry in the same way. And that's exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation: what it actually takes to stop each of these 9 patterns in practice, why some of them will feel more difficult to release than others, and why the version of you that emerges on the other side of genuinely stopping all 9 isn't smaller or more withdrawn, but considerably more fully, finally, yourself. Let's talk about what it actually takes to stop each of these 9 patterns in practice, because understanding them intellectually, as we did in the first half, is only the beginning. The actual work of interrupting decades-old habits requires something more specific than simple willpower, and it's worth walking through what that looks like, pattern by pattern. For the first habit, apologizing for rest, the actual practice is almost absurdly simple to describe, even though it takes real repetition to internalize. State the need for rest as a fact rather than a request. I'm resting this afternoon, instead of, I'm sorry, would it be okay if I rested this afternoon? This small linguistic shift matters more than it seems, because language shapes the internal experience of whether something is negotiable. Practicing this shift, even in small, low-stakes moments, gradually retrains the reflex that's been running in the opposite direction for decades. For the second habit, treating every crisis as an emergency requiring you, the practice involves building a genuine pause before responding to distress, long enough to actually assess whether the situation requires your specific, immediate involvement, or whether it's simply been assumed by habit that it does. This pause feels uncomfortable at first, because the old reflex to jump in immediately has been so thoroughly reinforced. But the pause itself is the entire mechanism of change. It interrupts the automatic response long enough for a more accurate assessment to actually occur. For the third habit, ignoring your body's signals in real time, the practice requires treating physical discomfort as legitimate data rather than something to override. This means actually leaving the gathering when your body signals enough, actually ending the phone call, actually excusing yourself from the conversation in the moment, rather than waiting until the discomfort becomes unbearable enough to justify the exit after the fact. For the fourth habit, managing other people's moods, the practice involves a specific internal question asked in real time. Did they actually ask for my help with this? Or have I simply assumed responsibility for it automatically? This question, asked honestly, often reveals that the vast majority of moods you've been managing were never actually requests at all, simply atmospheres you'd trained yourself to absorb and fix without ever being asked to. For the fifth habit, minimizing your own accomplishments, the practice is deceptively simple. State things plainly, without the reflexive, softening language that's been attached for decades. I did well on this, instead of I got lucky, I guess, or it wasn't a big deal. This plain statement feels exposing at first. Precisely because minimization has become so habitual, it feels like modesty, rather than what it actually is. For the sixth habit, maintaining one-sided relationships out of history, the practice requires an honest, private accounting over the last year specifically. Has this relationship given anything close to what it's taken? This isn't about ending long relationships abruptly or cruelly. It's about consciously redirecting the proportion of energy invested gradually toward relationships that actually demonstrate reciprocity now, rather than continuing to invest primarily based on what a relationship represented decades earlier. For the seventh habit, seeking permission for your own decisions, the practice is simply making decisions and informing people afterward, rather than asking beforehand in situations where the decision was always genuinely yours to make. This distinction matters enormously because informing is different from requesting, and practicing the difference deliberately in small decisions first builds the capacity to eventually extend it to larger ones. For the eighth habit, saying yes automatically to every request, the practice involves inserting a mandatory pause before any answer, even a single sentence. Let me think about it and get back to you. This single habit, practiced consistently, breaks the automatic yes reflex more effectively than almost anything else on this list, because it creates space for an actual, honest assessment of capacity before any commitment gets made. For the ninth habit, deferring your own desires indefinitely, the practice requires picking one specific, genuine desire right now and actually scheduling it concretely rather than continuing to hold it as a someday intention. This might be something small, a class you've always wanted to take, a trip you've always wanted to plan. But the act of actually scheduling it, rather than continuing to defer it, breaks the pattern of treating your own life as permanently postponable. I want to say something important about why some of these 9 will feel considerably harder to release than others, because the difficulty isn't random. The patterns most tightly bound to your sense of identity, being reliable, being the strong one, being endlessly capable, will resist change the most, precisely because releasing them can feel, temporarily, like losing a piece of who you are, rather than simply releasing a habit that's outlived its usefulness. This is worth expecting in advance, so that the discomfort of releasing these particular patterns doesn't get mistaken for evidence that the change itself is wrong. I want to say something honest about the timeline this actually takes, because I don't want to leave the impression that any of this happens quickly or cleanly. Decades-old patterns don't dissolve in weeks. Most people working through this list genuinely need months, sometimes years, of repeated practice, repeated slipping back into old habits, and repeated recommitment before the new patterns start to feel more natural than the old ones. This isn't failure. It's simply the accurate timeline for change of this depth, and expecting anything faster tends to produce discouragement that derails the process entirely. I want to leave you with something important about what actually waits on the other side of genuinely stopping these 9 things, because it's worth understanding clearly before we close. The version of you that emerges isn't less caring, less attentive, or less capable of deep connection. If anything, the capacity for genuine care becomes more concentrated, more freely given, because it's no longer being drained by decades of reflexive obligation. You become able to help because you genuinely want to, rather than because you've never questioned whether you had to. You become able to rest without negotiation, to say no without guilt, to want things for yourself without immediately deferring them to some vague future that may not actually arrive with the abundance of time you've always assumed it would. I want to leave you with an image, because I think it captures everything we've walked through today. Picture a river that has, for decades, been diverted through dozens of small channels, feeding fields and gardens and mills all along its original course, giving generously to everything nearby, spreading itself thin across every possible use anyone downstream ever found for it. For years, this arrangement worked, because the river's source seemed inexhaustible, and there always seemed to be enough water to keep every channel running without anyone needing to ask whether the main river itself was actually thriving underneath all that generous diversion. Now picture someone finally walking the length of that river, channel by channel, and beginning, deliberately, to close the ones that were never actually necessary, the ones built out of habit rather than genuine need, the ones feeding fields that have long since gone fallow, the ones simply left open because nobody ever thought to ask whether they still served any real purpose at all. Closing each channel feels, at first, like a loss, like water that used to flow somewhere is now being withheld from wherever it used to go. But here's what happens to the main river itself. Once enough of these unnecessary channels are finally closed, it deepens. It gains real current again, real force, real capacity to actually reach the places that still genuinely need it, rather than arriving everywhere in the thin, exhausted trickle that decades of over-diversion had reduced it to. The river isn't smaller for having closed those channels. It's finally, for the first time in decades, actually itself again, full, deep, and capable of genuinely nourishing whatever it still chooses to reach, rather than continuing to spread itself so thin across every old habit and obligation that nothing downstream, including the river itself, was ever really getting what it needed. That is what stopping these 9 things actually makes possible. Not a smaller life, a deeper one, finally flowing with the fullness that was always there, underneath decades of unnecessary diversion, waiting for someone to finally walk the length of the river and ask, honestly, which channels actually deserved to keep running and which ones had simply been left open far longer than they ever needed to be.